Good evening. Welcome to a special author event organized by the Harrison Public Library and the Village Bookstore of Pleasantville. My name is Bob Herster, and I'm a librarian at the Harrison Public Library. Tonight, Daniel Levin will be in conversation with Tom Wright, author of Billion Dollar Whale. They will be discussing Levin's new book, Proof of Life, 20 Days on the Hunt for a Missing Person in the Middle East. The son of a diplomat, Daniel Levin spent his early years in the Middle East and in Africa and then trained as a lawyer. He's currently a board member of the Liechtenstein Foundation for State Governance, and he has, for the past 20 years, worked with governments and development institutions worldwide, focusing on economic development and political reform through financial literacy, political inclusion, and constitutional initiatives. He's also engaged in Track 3 diplomacy and mediation efforts in war zones. Levin's first book, Nothing But a Circus, Misadventures Among the Powerful, was published in Germany, Japan, Russia, and the UK. Proof of Life is his first book to be published in the US. In this book, Mr. Levin describes what ensued when he responded to a call from an acquaintance with an urgent request to meet in Paris. A young man had gone missing in Syria. No government, embassy, or intelligence agency would help. This begins the suspenseful, shocking, and at times brutal true life story that finds Levin navigating the seedy and dangerous underbelly of the Middle East, where he encounters powerful sheiks, drug lords, and sex traffickers in pursuit of the truth. The book has received praise from notable writers, including Nobel Prize winner Daniel Kahneman, Pulitzer Prize winner Carrie Elliott House, and Ian Bremmer, president of the Eurasia Group. Tom Wright is the co-author of Billion Dollar Whale and the co-founder of Project Brazen, a journalism-focused production studio. Tom worked for the Wall Street Journal for over 20 years. He's a Pulitzer finalist and has won numerous journalism awards, including the Gerald Loeb Award for International Reporting. In 2020, Stanford University honored Tom with its Shorenstein Award in recognition of his services to journalism in Asia. So please type your questions in the chat interface, and toward the end of the talk here, I will ask them, and the authors will try to answer your questions. And please keep yourself muted unless you chat with us verbally during the Q&A. And also note that this event is being recorded. So with that, here we go.
Thanks for that great introduction. It's wonderful to be here. So Daniel, I wanted to just start by asking you, I think what this book does so well is it melds two things. It's an adventure story about your search for a kidnapped person, and we won't give away what happens at the end of this search. But it's also a discussion of what war really is about. And I think that's one of the most interesting things about it. People think of the Syrian war as being an ideological conflict, but really, I think what I learned from your book is that there's very little ideology. This is about trading things, and lots of different things get traded. And one of the things that's getting traded is the hostage at the center of the adventure story. Did you set out when you started thinking about this book, and tell us a little bit about the process of how you came about started thinking about it, to meld those two things, the adventure story and the desire to show what war is really about?
I don't think so. I wrote the book almost initially in the form of a diary. I didn't set out to make a particular point at all. I mean, the background for this whole book was a work that had been done in Syria after the Arab Spring started in 2012, 2013, where the war was very much still undecided, where there was some thought that it was a typical Arab Spring country. There was a revolt against the raise of bread prices by the regime. That's how it all started. And instead of just defanging that by not increasing the bread prices, the regime decided to beat a few young children to death, and that triggered a much larger uprising and so on. But initially it was the typical sort of Tunisian type of Arab Spring scenario. And then that morphed into something entirely different. Now, the war could have been ended at several points in the process. And I'm talking pre-2015 when Russia got involved and when the war was tilted towards Assad and he had no incentive to end it anymore. When I was involved at the time, 2012 and 13, it was very clear that it would be a zero-sum game, that no side could really emerge victoriously. So there was an incentive still to come to terms. And what at the time prevented that was, in fact, this war economy, this just hugely lucrative trade in people, in drugs, in every single good you can possibly imagine, from food to heating oil to diesel to medicine to blankets to clean water. Everything got traded at a huge premium. So the very few families and individuals, usually affiliated with the regime, who could control those markets became multimillionaires, in some cases even billionaires, over a few months. And it was this type of war economy that prevented this war from being ended way before the events in my book, which took place in late 2014.
Well, let's take a step back about the Syrian conflict for everybody. So, I mean, we forget, as you said, that this conflict started out of the Arab Spring over a decade ago. I mean, right now, 380, 400,000 people have died minimum, because there are many more. Those are the confirmed deaths in that conflict. There are many more people we don't know where they are, maybe a couple of 100,000 more. So we're looking at, over half a million deaths in that conflict. And we forget the genesis of it, which was an anti-government protest about food prices, a protest about Bashar al-Assad's regime. 10 years on, and there's a great scene in your book where there's I think it's a German tourist who's in an airport in Istanbul saying, look, this war's never going to end. This is some kind of Darwinian need to get rid of a people that want to slaughter each other. And you bring that character in very derisively, and rightly so, because as you said, what's really going on is there are lots of different people with different agendas in that country, all of whom are getting extremely rich. Can you explain some of those people? It's a very complicated situation in Syria, but can you explain very simply, like, what some of those forces are that keep the conflict going?
Syria never had been a country with strong sectarian or religious divides. Of all the countries in the Middle East, it was probably the country where the different members of different groups just socially and culturally got along the best. It wasn't very fertile ground for Islamist parties, for example, and the Brotherhood in Egypt never really managed to have any roots in Syria. It never was the case. But what of course happened is when Bashar al-Assad's father, Hafez al-Assad, came to power in a coup, the rule of a minority sect coming from the coastal region, the Alawi sect, which is a Shia Islamic arm, came to power. And Hafez al-Assad was very shrewd. He balanced out the playing out different tribes and different groups against each other. He had favors. He always had members of other groups in his regime. And then when he needed to be really brutal, like in an uprising, he had absolutely no scruples and had no problem killing 4,000 people to make sure people remembered what the alternative was. He managed to keep that kind of a balance. I wouldn't say peace, it's an odd word in such an authoritarian regime, for a long time. The idea was that his oldest son would be his successor. His oldest son was very fond of fast cars and so died in a car accident. And so the second son, Bashar al-Assad, he was an ophthalmologist with a massive lisp, certainly not anyone with no charisma whatsoever. No one would have ever thought that he was destined for leadership. And what happened to him is when he was challenged for the first time in 2011, in order to prove his manhood, he basically responded way more violently and viscerally than would have been necessary, obviously, than would have been advisable. I'm talking now purely from his perspective. That uprising was really just about food prices. It would have been fairly easy to end it. Syria wasn't a typical Arab Spring country, but he responded with such brutality that it triggered just a forest fire throughout the countries, first in Damascus, in Homs and Hama, all the way up to Aleppo and other parts of the country. This is way before the invasion of Islamist fighters out of Iraq in 2014. So it was, as all wars are, it was utterly preventable, and also perhaps as many wars are, started out of an insecurity complex of a particular authoritarian leader.
We'll talk about in a moment about what causes Westerners to go to Syria, because the hostage at the center of this is a Westerner. At least I believe it is a Westerner. You take pains to protect the identity of that person. But there's also a character, a fascinating character in your book called Anas, who is really, it's a search for Anas, your book in a way, because Anas is this key kingpin who you hope will lead you to the hostage. Anas is somebody who benefits greatly from the war. Now I know he's called Captagon Anas because he deals in the drug Captagon, which is part of the war economy in Syria. Explain a little bit about Anas and where he sits in the very complicated number of groups you've got in Syria, because I think in a way you keep him, he's not ideologically driven. And so it's hard. People tend to think of it as being Syria versus the Western-backed rebels versus Nusra or ISIS, whatever it is. But this character seems to not really care about ideology. He's just making a lot of money for himself.
Anas is one of those characters. He grew up always in the crime underworld, but understood the economics of a country such as Syria very well, where a few people controlled large parts of the economy. He knew not to tread into that. So, for example, the Assad family controlled the weapons trade. They controlled certain parts of the food industry. Their cousin, Rami Makhlouf, had a telecom monopoly. So Anas, as a very shrewd trader and dealer in the case of drugs, understood immediately which parts of the economy were still up for grabs. You see this, by the way, in many, many civil wars, where those who are the most successful understand where they can compete and where they cannot. So he wasn't going to challenge the regime's trade in weapons initially, obviously, because that would have been a fatal mistake. He immediately identified the drug Captagon, which is an amphetamine being mass-produced in Syria right now. It's not new to Syria. Captagon is a drug that's existed since the 60s. It was developed in the early 60s in Germany by a group called Chemiewerke Homburg. And that's not that surprising, actually, because when it comes to wartime amphetamines, Germany has pretty much cornered the market. In the Second World War, Hitler's troops had an amphetamine called Pervitin. It was a big part of the Blitzkrieg and their ability to drive for 4 and 5 days to Western Europe. And so this is not new too. In the 60s, it was still used as medication. It was used for depression. But then starting in the early 80s, doctors worldwide realized that Captagon had unbelievably pernicious side effects, increased toxicity levels in blood and in the heart so dramatically that it was declared illegal everywhere. When the war started in Syria, one of Captagon's terribly insidious benefits is it's very easy to manufacture. If you give someone a kid's chemistry kit and a scale, they can make Captagon. And it started to get mass produced a little before the war, but then when the war started, really massively. And there were different parts of the country. Hezbollah, the Lebanese Shia militia, got in on that trade too. Mostly it was in the labs in the Northeast. And Anas started to realize that the same trade routes that you would have for Captagon, which has now turned into an epidemic all over the world. Saudi Arabia, there's an estimate that a majority of Saudi males between 15 and 25 are addicted to Captagon, to this amphetamine. It's as much of a party drug as other things. It's being sold in blister packs to make it look like it's medication. It's really an epidemic, and especially in the Gulf, especially Lebanon, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, all of the Gulf countries, but now also Southern Europe, in Greece and Spain and Italy, it's becoming a big problem. And so Anas recognized just the huge margins of this kind of a drug. And what he also did is he started to combine other industries where the regime hadn't cornered the market. For example, the prostitution and the trade in sex slaves. So he combined the two and used the same couriers that he used for his Captagon sales from Syria all over the Middle East and the Gulf and in the Mediterranean region. He used the same thing to traffic young girls that he would take from little villages all over Syria and traffic to the Gulf. I describe the case of 2 such young girls, now young women, in the book.
Well, that's a moving part of the book. So we should just explain that Anas, the reason that Daniel in the book is searching for this kind of despicable character Anas, is because Daniel has information that Anas is somehow involved in the kidnapping of Paul, this hostage, which is the whole point of the book. And Anas is almost like the Wizard of Oz, a sort of much more evil version of the Wizard of Oz that Daniel hopes will answer his questions. And Daniel finds him in this, I guess it's a nightclub or a bar in Dubai at some point in the book. And there's an extraordinary scene where now I've been a journalist all my career for 25 years, and I'm amazed by what Daniel can pull off. There are some really amazing scenes where he's able to get to people and get them talking, which is no easy feat, and that's what really makes this book special. He finds Anas and explain a little bit about what it was like when you actually get to meet him in a nightclub. And unlike a journalist where I would always say, I'm a journalist and I'm interviewing you, that would always be my code of conduct. You were not beholden to any of that because you're looking for a hostage. The stakes are extremely high. Somebody could die based on your actions. And you find Anas in a nightclub in Dubai. Explain a little bit about the club and what it was like when you finally met this character.
So I first ultimately I was directed towards him by a group of people who told me that he at some point had held this person that I was looking for, and if I wanted to know what had happened to this person, that Anas would be at least the next step. If I wouldn't get the information there, he'd be the next step to lead me to that information. Anas really embodies the war just in its crude brutality. There's nothing refined about him. He's shrewd in the sense that he understands the conflict and what keeps it alive, and he understands how much he benefits from him. But ultimately, it's the kind of person who replaces nuance with just brutality and with violence. And I knew that because in order to get to him, I had to interact with people who had known him and who also suffered from him. And so I was pretty prepared. And I also knew that I couldn't walk up to him and explain why I needed this information. This is not the person who would just share it with me out of the kindness of his heart, or in any kind of traditional setting of asking a question, whether as a journalist or just socially, wouldn't work. So I spent a lot of time wrecking my brain on how I would ever be able to extract this kind of information from him, other than just getting extremely lucky because he would happen to mention it, which is not a bet that would make sense. So I first looked for him in this nightclub in Dubai called Jules Bar, which is really just a meat market for people. This is really where prostitutes are told to wait for men who go pick them up. People don't stay there very long. It's really extremely loud music in there. It's an unbelievably unpleasant place. I went in there looking for him. Didn't find him there, but was told that he usually holds court at a restaurant called Casamia right outside Jules Bar. This is a hotel compound in Dubai, the Meridian compound, not far from the airport. And that's where I ended up connecting with him. And I had to figure out, how do I get this information? It's not a person I could intimidate. Physically, obviously, I couldn't intimidate. He's 5 inches taller than I am, about 200 pounds of sheer muscle, bigger and stronger than I am. There was no scenario in which I would be able to intimidate him. And I also, this was not a person I could just bait into giving me the information with something that might be of value to him. I'm not able to pay for information, and there was nothing. He's stupendously wealthy, obviously, from his activities. So there was really nothing I could really think of that would make him interested in sharing that information, almost trade-like. Ultimately came up with the only path I thought might be possible, which is to flatter him into revealing this information. He was extremely vain. He was a workout fanatic and a steroid fanatic. This was really someone who looked like The Rock on steroids, essentially. I mean, that large. And I ultimately flattered him into revealing at least what I needed to find out. And it was a miserable experience in the sense that I was constantly mapping my escape. I knew that I didn't control the situation entirely. And if I ever thought there was a chance that he also had been warned that I might talk to him, because I had to, in order to get to him, I had to track down first his associates in Jordan, in Amman. And there was a possibility that they might have told him that I was looking for him, and I'm obviously not going to reveal any spoilers now, but it was a very stressful encounter with this guy. Aside from the fact that he's such a repulsive individual, it was a pretty stressful encounter.
Yes, I mean, I can't imagine how fast your heart must have been beating when you were sitting in there. And then you also have to suppress your revulsion from these characters, don't you? When your greater good is to try to save a life, a hostage in Syria, you have to basically pander to this guy. You're saying all kinds of things about him that I'm sure you didn't want to say. Like, I think he has a $130,000 T-shirt he's wearing, he claims, because it's covered in diamonds, ripped jeans. You've just, I think on your way in, you had seen a man, or maybe the previous day in the same nightclub looking for Anas, you'd seen a man pulling a teenage Syrian trafficked prostitute by her hair, and you confronted him. And so you're not in your normal world. You had to enter that world to try to get what you wanted. So tell us a little bit about the emotions of doing that kind of work.
You have to compartmentalize. Obviously, you're not going to interact with a lot of people you find pleasant, and usually the nicer someone is, the less they have the ability to give you information that's useful for you. But throughout these 20 days, there were also people who were extremely generous and kind in helping without even any benefit to them. So it's really those interactions and friends in the Middle East and also in Dubai and the Gulf that sustained me in that. You know who you're dealing with. And over these 20 days, it's not just Anas, I had to interact with several people, not just people I found repulsive, but people who would have been very hostile had they known more about my own background. So it was definitely tense, and I tried to do everything I could to stay safe in terms of having not just escape plans and strategies, but also having a cover and an identity in those interactions that would make sense. So, it's not that hard to suppress the repulsion. Perhaps it's because the fear does that. It's not a relaxed setting. You don't have the luxury to just sort of muse over how vicious this individual is. You really just try to work step by step to get a little bit closer to the information.
Let's take a step back to how you get to Anas, because Anas is really the penultimate step to the hostage. So most people would have no idea how to go about finding a hostage in Syria. But of course, because of the work you've done in track 3 diplomacy and for many years, you have a network of contacts throughout the Middle East, very, very high level. And I don't know if we can talk about who the Sheikh really is. There's a character you call the Sheikh in your book. I'm not sure if you can talk about that on a recorded conversation. But one of the keys to getting to Anas is this character called the Sheikh in Lebanon that you go to visit earlier in the book. I know who the Sheikh is. I think a lot of people who know about the Middle East can look it up, or they can Google famous sheikhs in Lebanon and find out who that probably is. But the kind of access you have is stunning to me. I mean, the kind of people you're able to go and pull on, and that's why you were dragged into this, dragged into trying to find this hostage. So tell us a little bit about those networks and how you've built them up over the years, and tell us a little bit about why you went to see that sheikh as your first port of call to lead you to Anas.
Well, I think that probably you're overstating my network and my ability, because mostly, and it came also in other hostage situations, the initial call I made is to a dear friend called Khalid Al-Mari, whom I identify in the book with his permission, who he's in fact the person who's so incredibly well connected. And he's my first triage. In other words, I contact him and I ask him whether that I was approached from a family or from a government or from a newspaper because a journalist went missing, and they want to know whether I can find out any information about the person. This is before you're negotiating any kind of release. That's the rarest, happiest moment, is this just getting proof of life. And the first call usually is to Khalid. There are some exceptions in other situations, but usually it's to him. And he will either tell me, I can help you, and this is the next person either I will talk to or you have to talk to, or I can't help you. In some cases, especially when ransom payments are involved, he will tell me right away, don't touch it. I hear there's a ransom payment negotiation and you can't do that. for all the reasons that we can get into another time. And so Khalid was my first call here. And unlike other situations, he told me that this time it would be necessary for me to travel to Beirut and actually sit down with the person I call the Sheikh. Yeah, people who know the Middle East or who read the footnotes carefully will probably get a pretty decent sense of who that is. It was a very powerful individual in Lebanon. And it wasn't so much that the Sheikh would only tell me something he wouldn't tell Khalid. That was not the case at all. It's just that he needed to meet me in person to even decide whether he's going to help me and direct me towards the people that can take me to the next step. So it was a night spent in Beirut just for that. And then what you're really doing is like you're pulling a string. You're just going from one source to the next one. And along the way, both Khalid and other people helped me, and also helped me avoid certain people that would have been very, very complicated to navigate around. So he's as much of a source as also a guardian angel in doing these things. But I would give a wrong impression to think that I fly to Beirut or Amman and have 20 people on my speed dial that I can just call and they're going to volunteer information. It's not like that. In any of these places, huge amounts of people who talk and claim to be extremely well connected and know something and can spend years just sharing rumors with you without any basis in fact. And then there are very few people, and they're usually not the chatty ones, who really do have the information. And then it's a question of developing enough of a relationship where they'll be willing to share that, either because they're kind or because in other contexts, in other situations, there's something I can do for them that will be of value. But these are all relationships that, sorry, just one more thing. These are relationships you have to cultivate way before you need them. You and I have spoken about this before, and you know this in your profession. It's a little bit like a surgeon who has to put an infusion before the surgery. If you wait for the surgery to start, you can't put an infusion because the blood pressure will drop and you won't find a vein. The same thing with these kinds of relationships. If you're waiting for a kidnapping to occur and then you start to try and develop relationships with people who can help you, there's no chance it's going to happen, and certainly not in time to find or save a person.
Right. So this character, Khalid Al-Mari, who, as you said, is a real person with a real name, and one of the few people with a real name in your book, he's what we would call in journalism, your golden source. And you're totally right. You have to know those people for multiple years before you need to call on them for information. And it needs to be a two-way street, even with journalism. If you are constantly just sucking up information from somebody, eventually they get tired of you. You need to be also giving them what you're hearing. And that's what I think is, again, so fascinating about Proof of Life, is that you're peeling open the onion to show how that world works. And this is the world in which, politics, international politics operates, right? When leaders talk to each other and make decisions, there are people like Khalid Al-Mari who are involved in those decisions. Now, he actually is a political decision maker, right? Khalid Al-Mari.
He's not a political decision maker. He's someone who grew up in Saudi Arabia. He was very close to King Abdullah when he was crown prince at the time, when the king actually had a stroke, and as a crown prince, Abdullah was running the country. And then there was a major falling out. I still actually don't know all the facts. Partly it had to do with Khalid favoring reforms that he claimed King Abdullah also favored, and the conservative wing in the royal family, led, funnily enough, or not so funnily, by current King Salman, who at the time was also funding Islamist charities in the Balkan War. And they had some kind of a falling out over it, and Khalid was given just a few hours to leave the country. He's still extremely well connected there, and he ended up going to Qatar. He and I met in Qatar many years ago because we were both happened to sit in a hotel lounge waiting for a person to pick us up for a meeting, different meeting, and we're sitting at the tables adjacent to each other. And we were both being stood up and getting annoyed that the persons picking us up were delayed. And it so happened that he and I were reading the same book. And that's how we started to talk and have remained really good friends ever since. It's utterly...
But not a decision maker in the sense of not a overt political decision maker, but the kind of person who has the ears of very powerful people.
Yeah. So, and for example, and very influential when ultimately after the U.S. election, when both the Saudi and the Emirati regime concluded that they now had to change the U.S. strategy because Donald Trump wasn't there anymore, and they had to be a little more conciliatory in their actions. One of the things they concluded is they had to end this embargo with Qatar, and they turned to Khalid to negotiate it. So he's very involved with them. But this whole story is a nice example where you can know decision makers, you can know heads of states and ministers in the region. They may not at all be willing or able to help you in something as messy as this kind of an underground hostage taking situation. So you need someone like him who has access really bottom up. This is not just about a king may say, oh yeah, I'd love to help you. It wouldn't have helped me one bit to go to a politician in Syria or in Lebanon or in Saudi Arabia and ask for help about that. It wouldn't have gone anywhere, either because they really aren't able, because they don't penetrate some of these jails and dungeons where hostages are kept, or because they couldn't care less about them and wouldn't be willing to help. So it is people like Khalid who have both the relationships to the top, but also really have their ears and feet on the ground that can really accomplish something.
Let's talk about the hostage trade. So you told me something fascinating recently. There are still a number of hostages in Syria. Most of them don't appear in the press. You know, we hear about some every now and again. There was Sam Goodwin, who was released recently, an American, who was going around the world trying to visit every country in the world. He got arrested and released. Why do Westerners continue to go to Syria? Is it because they're normally ideological? They see this as the worst crime against humanity that's going on in our era, and that it's been underreported or forgotten after 10 years, 400,000 deaths, and they want to go and do good? Is it because they're slightly strange people who've lost their way and they take these very, very dangerous decisions, or can you not make a blanket statement like either of those?
So let's for a moment exclude the combatants. You have certainly mercenaries who fight in Syria on all sides of the war. There are also many European mercenaries. In each country, their place of origin has its own social issues. In France, it's the North African youth or the children of North African immigrants who are disaffected, move there. In Russia, it's a lot of people from Chechnya and Dagestan. So, and when they go back to their countries, they create a problem. So let's take combatants out of the answer to this question. There are currently, I'm aware of 12 Westerners, just US, Canada, and the UK, and that's just the people I'm aware of, who have been taken hostage in Syria, whose names have not been made public. And generally, if a person is taken hostage, before you know that you have a pathway to a release, the overwhelming reason people are taken hostage is for payment. And the first thing that happens when the families or the organizations that sent the individuals make that public and go public with their pleas, very understandable because they're so unbelievably desperate and such agony, is that the captors immediately believe that the value of their asset has risen. They either believe it's a wealthy asset or it's an asset tied to a foreign intelligence agency. Usually the agency of choice is the CIA, but not exclusively. And so what happens when a family goes public with it is that they immediately decrease the likelihood of ever finding this person exponentially. And I really mean exponentially. And so when I have a chance, when I am approached about this, I very rarely want to get involved in a case that already has been made public, because it is so extremely hard to affect something in that moment. Everything you're trying to accomplish in the process of getting proof of life and releasing a hostage is easier to accomplish without the name being public. In very, very rare instances, does public pressure, and usually then by a head of state of the hostage's home country, work, but only if that head of state and that government is willing to give something in return, some form of a trade, taking someone off a sanctions list, arranging for cancer treatment for a president or minister's mother. If you're willing to trade a favor in return, then it makes sense, but otherwise not. And so when you ask me why people go, the reasons are really very broad. There are doctors who go there out of the kindness of their heart, many times dual citizens, and they suffer the most brutal fates. In other words, Syrian and British dual citizens, Syrian American, Syrian German, Syrian French dual citizens, who feel that their families got out at some point under the Assad reign, the father's reign, and they want to give back to their country. And the hospitals in Aleppo, in Raqqa, in Homs, Hama, in Damascus are full of such volunteers. Doctors Without Borders is very active in Aleppo also. So there are a lot of aid workers and doctors and nurses who go for ideological reasons and are taken hostage. And then you have the dirty little secret in your profession, Tom, which is that you have journalists, and usually freelance journalists, which is that there are most newspapers and media organizations don't really want to send their correspondents into war zones. And so there is this enormous pool of freelancers, very often young freelancers and even students who want to show that they can really be war correspondents, and they go back to they have all studied the traditions of the great war correspondents, Richard Kapuscinski and others, and they want to make their mark. And those are very difficult. And as we know, there've been in 2014 awful executions, decapitations of several Western journalists, James Foley, Stephen Sotoloff, and others, just shortly before the events of this book. So journalists are a category in their own. It's often freelancers or freelance photographers that get captured there. In some cases not, obviously people like Marie Colvin, who I talk about in my book, who tragically died in the war. And then you have a category of, let's call them adventurers. You mentioned Sam Goodwin, others, people who are not even freelance journalists, people who are aspiring freelance journalists. In other words, they're not being even sent, or their articles aren't being printed by anybody, but they really want to either make a mark, or they feel like they can really connect with the Syrian people. They really want to see what it's like and experience what it's like. Those are, there is a large category of those, and those are those who really very, very rarely have any value to their captors. And the chance of getting them out depends entirely on which group has them. If it is a group that can benefit in any way from having made a goodwill gesture, there's a chance of getting them out. Usually under the condition that the whole thing stays private. No memoirs are written, no press conferences, no photo opportunities with the head of state, that the whole thing stays quiet. And then you can tap into a network of helpers, including helpers in the intelligence community, that's willing to help in those moments. But there's, and I'm just mentioning the 12 that I am aware of those 3 countries. I am certain that that's nothing close to the actual number.
I think you're right about journalists. I worked for 20 years at the Wall Street Journal, and obviously we very famously had Daniel Pearl, who was beheaded in Karachi in 2003 or 2002, I think it was. I actually ended up doing that job in Pakistan after him, and the journal was always very, very worried about security after that. I think the New York Times had a reporter who died on the border between Turkey and or a photographer maybe, who died on the border between Turkey and Syria. And so that pushes freelancers into that area, because it's a way you could make your name if you really came and got a big story. But I think one of the things that's so tragic about those journalists is that ultimately the Syrian conflict is becoming forgotten, and people just don't care. So I mean, which is a tragedy in itself, but they're taking huge risks, and really it's very, very hard to operate once you get into that country. I mean, it's hard to know. You might get taken in by an opposition group. And then what happens is these hostages, as you explain in the book, are traded between different groups because they're seen as a commodity. And again, it's really the theme of this book is the commoditization of war. There's the young teenage girls who are trafficked by Anas to the UAE and sold into sexual slavery. There's the Captagon addicts that you've described to us today. And then these hostages are also just another commodity, right? That people hope will get them money, not even publicity, right?
Yeah, generally that is the case. There are some very few cases where a group can hold the hostage and release it for some form, let's call it political benefit. That can be the fact that a bank account of one of the group's couriers got frozen. And if you catch the right decision makers at the right moment, you can get a bank account unfrozen of a hostage taker or a courier, and get someone released, or at least get proof of life for that. But the hardest thing about it is certain groups, and certainly all the groups affiliated with the regime, and the regime is extremely active in the hostage business, have almost no incentive ever to release a person, because what happens when someone is captured is the first question, unfortunately, goes straight to the regime, and they immediately deny they've never heard of that, and they blame what they call the terrorists in the country, which includes everyone, not them. And so the chance of them afterwards ever releasing this person, ever admitting ever having had him, immediately goes away if you've asked that question. So you have to become, what they say about a good lawyer, you never ask a question if you don't already know the answer. In other words, if you're going to approach the regime in any way, directly or indirectly, because you know or suspect that they have a hostage, you can only do that with already a certain amount of evidence so that you can immediately threaten to embarrass them if they don't work with you. And of course, if you possess that amount of evidence, the likelihood that you'd need to have this conversation is pretty slim. There are some odd constellations where that can happen. So there are very few happy endings to this process because, again, there are hostages who are captured by a militia connected to the regime in the western coast in Tartus or Latakia. And then a week later, they show up with the Nusra rebels near Aleppo, and a month later, they're in Raqqa with ISIS. And from ISIS, they can go back to the regime. I know several such cases who've had that kind of a cycle, including, unfortunately, some who were executed and whose names were made public. So for the hostage industry, they make absolutely no distinction between trading in hostages and trading in drugs or trading in commodities. It is really commodified, with the only exception that a hostage is a bit of a pain because it costs some money and some effort to make sure they stay in prison, that they don't escape, and obviously you have to feed them and so on. So beyond that, it's really entirely just treated as any kind of commodity.
So Daniel, tell us a little bit about how somebody ends up becoming a hostage, someone on the search for a hostage. How did you get to this point? How did your career unfold that you ended up doing this kind of work?
This isn't my career. I certainly never set out to do this. I'm a lawyer by training, and this kind of work only started because of the work of the foundation that I'm running in Europe. And the mission of the foundation is to help either rebuild failed states or help states that are really in dire straits rebuild in some form. And the methodology is by identifying young next generation promising candidates and try to prepare them for future leadership. That's the approach of the foundation. And it's just because of our efforts in Syria, which, by the way, failed miserably the moment the war tipped in favor of Assad. That project ended with a whimper. So that wasn't a project I'm particularly proud of. But it was because of that work in the region that I had those kinds of relationships, or that I was approached, I should say, with the cries for help for some people who had gone missing. That's the context. It's not that I set out to be a hostage negotiator and describe myself as a hostage negotiator. And there are some very serious hostage negotiators also with the intelligence community who have very specific kind of skill sets and are trained over years to do that and very effective about it. I don't in any way pretend to be that. This is what I describe here is exactly how that kind of a request happens, and the way I have to sort of wing it over these 20 days to try to get closer to the information. If anyone gets the impression that I'm sitting here teaching a masterclass in hostage negotiation, that's a very, very poor impression of what I do. That's not at all my strength.
So tell us about the US's role in the Syrian conflict. And I know there are elections happening soon in Syria, which will probably just be a rubber stamp for Assad's regime. Just explain very simply, and I guess it's very complex, so let's keep it simple, how the US has interacted with Assad's regime in this conflict over the last 10 years, and how do the great powers fit into this? Russia, Iran, some of the other countries that have a stake in the game.
Every country has a completely different perspective on the role. Before we get to the US, for Russia, it's clearly returned to its glory days of the Cold War. It's something Putin has never stopped lamenting, the collapse of the Soviet Union. And so for him, the Syrian conflict was a fairly easy way to regain that foothold and have naval ports in the Mediterranean now that he has in the area controlled by the regime in Western Syria. For Putin, it's that plus, of course, commercial interests and a way to And most of the Russian soldiers who are there are not enlisted Russian soldiers. He's not going to make the same mistake he made in Afghanistan. There are mercenaries in the Wagner group that is run by uh, some of his closest associates. The same mercenaries who are popping up in other conflicts, such as Libya, helping Khalifa Haftar in the east in Libya. So for Russia, there's a lot of geopolitics. Now the Wagner group just signed some oil contracts in Western Syria. So there's, of course, always some commerce involved in it, too. And they were also involved in the Captagon trades, but mostly it's a geopolitical foothold because since the end of the Cold War in the late 80s and early 90s, Putin has sort of been just biting at the licking his chops, trying to get back into the sort of superpower game, especially since everyone's talking about a G2 world with the US and China, which really irritates him. So Putin has that type of aspirations. For Iran, it's very clear, despite both the Iranian regime and the Iranian population primarily, and the Syrian regime being members of Shia Islam, the Alawi sect of Shia Islam of the Assad family is not at all close with the clerical leadership in Iran, in Tehran. For Syria, their primary purpose of supporting the regime in Damascus is that Iran wants to control a border with Israel. And that is their access to that border. It's plain and simple. Any Iranian official, intelligence, military, revolutionary guard, civilian, use that word lightly, not a lot of them, but any one of them will confirm that to you. Now, for the US, it gets a little more complicated because there's so much talk of the US's forever wars, the disastrous Iraq war, which basically did the most to strengthen the Iranian regime by removing its one natural enemy in Saddam Hussein. The US has been in this constant identity crisis when it comes to foreign policy, whether these are wars that we want to carry on, whether that makes sense to focus on it. Shouldn't we focus really in the South Pacific and on the clashes that may happen with China at some point, and on the clashes over the Deo Islands, or what the Japanese call Senkaku Islands there? Does it really make sense for the US? And so when you even watch the campaign in the recent presidential elections, both 5 years ago and also 1 year ago, most of it sort of in foreign policy centered around, if we take just the clown show out of this discussion for a moment, most of the discussion on foreign policy focused on whether the US should be more isolationist or nationalist. Should they really just focus more on its very narrow interests domestically, or should the US still be a policeman in the world? And so this sort of undecided, slightly schizophrenic approach that you see the US have to the region is a result of, I would say, the last 15 years, certainly since the Iraq War, not trying to figure out what it is, trying to draw down from Iraq, trying to draw down from Afghanistan. Of course, the usual rhetoric that we stand by our allies in the region and so on, but really trying to understand it. And the countries in the region have figured that out too. So when the Saudis and the Emiratis now send senior people, really senior people, members of the royal family to Tehran to start to drink coffee together and try to get along, they're not doing that because they just suddenly discovered their love for the people that they considered their, well, I would say antichrist, anti-prophet, I guess is the right term here. They didn't just discover their love for that. The reason they're doing it is they're observing a US retreat from the region. And they realize that even the protection treaty that the US had with Saudi Arabia in return for continuing to price oil in US dollars and maintain the US dollar as a global reserve currency and so on, all those types of balances, geopolitical balances, are changing. And the countries in the region are acutely aware of it. You know this as well as I do, Tom. You experienced this. And so we're witnessing, despite the noise and despite the rhetoric, and if you live in the US, despite watching the reactions to the conflicts in the Middle East in the US, both within Congress and the population, in fact, from the perspective of a region, they're watching a retreat. And so, and there are a number of milestones to that. Definitely in terms of just statements, when President Obama in August 2013 said that if Assad ever moved chemical weapons around the country, let alone thought of using them, that would definitely constitute a red line. That's the famous red line that Senator McCain said he believed was written with invisible ink. Because when a year later, in August 2013, there was a chemical attack in Ghouta and others, horrific attacks where hundreds of children, women, men died. there was absolutely no reaction. There are some conspiracy theories that Cy Hirsch likes to spout that in fact it wasn't the regime, but there's without a doubt that the regime has deployed chemical weapons, as have members of the militias, the Islamist militias in the countries too. And so when the countries in the region observe this non-reaction, we're not even back to President Clinton's days of deploying a few Tomahawk missiles. When they're watching this non-intervention of the US, they're just watching a retreat from the region. And this debate, what the US really wants to do in the Middle East, does it make sense to do anything? Should there just be a few strategic partners? This calibration hasn't yet taken place. Secretary Blinken's current visit there is not going to make a big difference there either. So the US has a lot of work to do, because in the meantime, it's ceding a lot of ground to other countries in the region.
It's so fascinating. Everyone, you have 8 minutes left to ask questions. If anyone has a question for Daniel, whatever it be, please type it in the box, or you can pop up on audio and ask it. And if you don't have any questions, we're gonna wrap this up at 8 p.m. But I have so many questions left to go, so I will battle on. So Daniel, I want to talk a bit, and I guess you saw this one coming. I want to talk a little bit about what's going on in Israel at the moment, because I think everyone listening will be pretty interested in that. Now, of course, the Israel-Hamas problem is a problem that's happening in Israel and in the Gaza Strip. It doesn't really have as much to do with Iran, of course. So Iran's militia is the Hezbollah, which is more in, as you were saying earlier, the reason that Iran wants to be in Syria is it wants to have a border with Israel, and obviously it controls Hezbollah in Lebanon, and that's a proxy for Iran. But what's going on in Israel is slightly different, isn't it? This is Hamas. This is happening in Israel proper. And one of the things that's extremely difficult for Israel right now is that it's actually happening inside Israel, not just in the Gaza Strip.
Yeah, there are a number of stories here to address. I think the one you mentioned last is, if you're looking at it as an Israeli, which I am, it's probably the most troublesome. There has been a fiction in Israeli Jewish society now, since the beginning of the war, since 1948, a fiction I was fed to as a kid, that there is some kind of a mystical distinction between what Israelis euphemistically call Israeli Arabs and Palestinians. And that distinction has been kept up throughout the history of the country in 1948, then in 1967 after the Six-Day War, when Israel occupied the West Bank and the Gaza Strip and the Golan Heights in 1973, in all these rounds. And the thinking always was, and Israelis kept saying it to themselves and to anyone who wanted to hear, that the problem Israel has is only with the Palestinians. At some point, even back to the Labour Party and Golda Meir and her idiotic statement that there is no Palestinian people, they're all Jordanians. There was always this sort of dismissive thing that the problem would just go away if the Palestinian population in the West Bank would just self-deport to Jordan, and the Palestinian population in Gaza would just self-deport to Egypt. Not asking whether Jordanians wanted that influx, which they don't, and the Egyptians certainly don't want the influx from Gaza. But it was all based on a lie, because it's exactly the same people. And the problem, of course, for the Palestinians started in 1948 with the creation of Israel. And perpetuating that kind of a myth has prevented, and actually it was a big part of the reason why a solution never was reached. And Israel always assumed when the intifadas, the two intifadas occurred, they were always with Palestinian populations in the West Bank, very little flaring up in Israel.
In the 1990s and 2000s.
In the 1990s and 2000s, right, apologies. And people always talked about, holding up the coexistence between Jews and Arabs in places like Haifa in the north, and in Yafo in south of Tel Aviv, and in Akko and other places like that. And most of the people who said that really didn't spend a lot of time there, because if you did spend time with the Palestinian population there, and if you speak Arabic to them, you'll hear the resentment and very quickly know that that was just ready to explode. And so what happened in the recent flare-up now, for the first time in all violence, there was massive hatred that exploded between Jews and Arabs and Jews and Muslims within green line borders Israel, meaning in places like Lod, which, by the way, not coincidentally, were the same towns where the massacres had occurred between the two ethnic groups pre-1948, pre-Israeli establishment. So one of the myths that came crumbling down in this now 11-day conflict with Gaza and Hamas is in fact that. Now, I don't want, we can get into it maybe if there's a question, but obviously the real beneficiaries of this conflict were Hamas and Benjamin Netanyahu, because Netanyahu's political career seemed over. It may well be, if we're lucky, but it certainly got another lifeline as a result of that. And Hamas, the same thing. Hamas was in danger of losing the street. Most of the rockets were not fired by Hamas. They were fired by Palestinian youths under 20-year-old who had homemade rockets. Now, that's the context here. The Hamas leadership was all in Qatar, in Doha, sipping tea, so they weren't at risk of losing their lives. And Hamas was at risk of losing it, but now because they got to present themselves as the protectors of the Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem, because the rockets were fired is a result of the Israeli police's actions in Jerusalem. Now they again have a status again as the liberators and the protectors of the Palestinian people. So it was an autogol, and it was horrific for anyone who's moderate and is interested in a solution. Now, to your other question, the first question, that's complicated, because I can tell you from my interactions with Israeli security establishment, they are worried about one thing and one thing only, because they know that the rockets that were fired out of Gaza now were a dry run for the rockets that Hezbollah has. And the rockets that came from Gaza, many were intercepted by the so-called Israeli Iron Dome, but they did do some damage. Israelis did die, and it did traumatize a nation because it hit population centers that hadn't been hit before, not since the Gulf War in 91 with Saddam Hussein's Scud-C rockets. Hezbollah has received Iranian missiles, highly sophisticated missiles, have at least 250,000 of them. If they rain down in Israel, the Israeli security establishment knows full well that the Iron Dome will not be able to protect the population. No matter how Israel retaliates, we're looking at an Armageddon type of scenario. So it's a bit of a red herring to just talk about this as a clash between Netanyahu and Hamas, when in fact, from the Iranian perspective, this was a dry run of that. And the Iranians are using the fact that the Israeli security establishment is scared, and really scared, of what Hezbollah would do if they decide to unleash it. And you've paid attention that senior people in Hezbollah have been in hiding and haven't said a word. The Iranians are using that possibility of a threat in their current negotiations with the US in the JCPOA, in the nuclear agreement right now. So there are geopolitical implications beyond just what meets the eye. And if you interact with Israelis beyond the political bluster of forming coalition and all the ugliness that's happened now, those who are really truly worried about keeping the country safe, that is the biggest fear right now. And they know that in that respect, Israel lost this round.
So you have Hamas in the Gaza Strip firing rockets, or as you said, Hamas supporters, it seems, firing rockets into Israeli townships. And then you have the much bigger fear of Hezbollah, which is much better funded militia supported by Iran, based all around the borders of Israel and threatening Israel. And that's the much bigger fear. And again, this takes us full circle back to Syria. This is why Syria is such a prize for multiple countries, because Iran wants to be as close to the borders of Israel as possible. Now, there are no questions, so I'm gonna wrap this up with a final one, because I think this is a fascinating thing that you've worked on. You know a lot about Iran and the nuclear negotiations there. Now, of course, Obama famously reached an agreement with Iran for Iran to stop its nuclear program. Trump ripped that up. Just tell us finally, before we close out tonight, what's the latest on the Iran US nuclear situation?
The tragedy of this discussion is, of course, that they're negotiating an agreement that doesn't have a whole lot of lifetime and shelf life left. So in other words, the only way this negotiation makes sense now is through an extension. It's being reported falsely as sort of a staring contest about who goes first. Do the Americans just stop the sanctions, or do the Iranians stop the proliferation and the enrichment? In the end, it's not really about that. The real discussion that's taking place, there are two angles that are not really being reported. One is the one I mentioned just now, which is that this agreement has to be extended for it to make any sense. And the second point is that conventional ballistic missiles, meaning non-nuclear missiles, have to be included in it. This is something that
just take a step back. Just explain very quickly what arrangement Obama came to with Iran. and why Trump ripped it up, and then just what happens now with a Biden administration.
So in a simplified way, the arrangement between the Obama administration and several European countries too, and the Iranians was that the Iranians would put a moratorium, a stop on enrichment, on uranium enrichment, in return for easing of sanctions and certain normalizations. It was always supposed to have a sunset, and the idea being two elements, both of which I agree with. One is it was either this agreement or no agreement. The right wing all over the world loves to argue that it's a bad agreement, including in Israel with Netanyahu, that it's a bad agreement because it didn't go farther. And the answer is, well, farther wasn't on the table. The two options were no agreement or disagreement. And the entire Israeli security establishment wanted the Americans to sign this agreement. It was the political establishment, Netanyahu, that was opposed to it. Now the discussion is the first sunset provisions, and it comes in layers and tiers depending on which centrifuges we're talking about and which nuclear sites, Natanz and others. The first one's already coming due now. So the agreement is close to being moot. The only way it makes sense is through an extension. And now the Iranians are saying the last time they negotiated in what they consider good faith, all it took is for someone else to come to power in the United States and tear up an agreement. It seems like they're negotiating with the wrong people. This is, by the way, something you'll see with many powers negotiating with the US. Chinese are making the same points, which is that whatever they negotiate is only going to last until the next election season, which is not so much, I'm not saying that to slam the US as much as it's one of those misconceptions that countries have when you have a democratic country, for better for worse, democratic country negotiating with an autocratic country, because an autocratic regime just can't simply understand how these things can't last as long as the autocrats want them to last. This is not just something that happens in nuclear negotiations. So it's a very delicate issue. And on top of that, on June 18th, you have the presidential elections in Iran. So it's a pretty combustible moment right now, and most of the likely candidates are generals of the Revolutionary Guards and the Quds Force, which was headed by Qasem Soleimani before he was killed. They're unlikely to be very conciliatory because it's being presented, the last agreement was being presented as one that the reformers were allowed to negotiate. Some of it is, I think, a bit of a theater, but it was presented that way. And look what it got the Iranians. The moment Donald Trump won, that was all over, and the Iranians had nothing to show for it. All the accounts were frozen again. So there's a lot of trust building that has to happen. It also shows that the way these things are being negotiated don't make a lot of sense, because it probably has to be a military to military negotiation, because the only party in the US that can maintain those commitments is actually Pentagon to foreign military types of negotiations. That's a chapter for another day, but since you asked, I'm try to give you a complete answer.
Fascinating. And yes, of course, I'm based out here in Asia, and China, I think, laughs at the US 4-year horizon for decision making. They have their 1,000-year horizon or whatever it is. So, but Daniel, thank you for your time today. It's if you haven't read it yet or bought it yet, Proof of Lives by Daniel Levin is a fantastic book. You should go out and buy it. And with that, I'll just pass it back to the library.
Yes, that was fascinating. I mean, there weren't any questions put in the chat. I think because, Tom, you asked all the questions. This was fascinating. Just fascinating. The Pleasantville Bookstore has the book, and wow, this was so interesting. Thank you so much to both of you. Thank you for writing the book. Thank you for your incredible questions, Tom. I was blown away. It was fascinating.
Thanks a lot. Thanks, Tom. Thanks, Bob.
Great.
Thanks, everyone.
Good evening, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Right. Good night, everybody.